Before the flight, I'm a mid-life version of Top Gun, wearing an Air Force helmet, a flight suit, and a smile the size of a watermelon slice. But after the flight, Top Gun is undone. I'm as pale as Marley's ghost. I list to one side, and my big smile has flattened as straight as the tarmac on which we just landed. You can chalk the change in expression up to 60 minutes of acrobatics in a T6 at 10,000 feet. I occupied the cockpit seat directly behind Lieutenant Colonel Tom McLean. 1 month shy of his retirement, he invited me to join him on an orientation flight. The invitation to fly in the T6 came complete with a pre-flight physical in which I was measured for the ejection seat, a safety briefing in which I practiced pulling the handle for the ejection seat, and a few moments in the harness of a training parachute simulating how I would return to Earth after any activation of the ejection seat. There was a lot of discussion of ejection seats. Turns out we didn't use it, which was no small accomplishment, since we dived and rose and dived again, sometimes with a vertical velocity of 10,000 feet per minute. Can you imagine a roller coaster minus the rails? We flew in tandem with another jet. At one point, the two wingtips were separated by 7 feet. I don't like to get that close to another person in the shopping mall. Here's what 1 hour of aerial somersaults taught me. Number one, fighter pilots are underpaid. I don't know what their salary is, but it's not enough. Anyone willing to protect their country at 600 miles an hour deserves a bonus. Number two, G's are well named. Funny, I always thought that phrase, pulling G's, had something to do with gravitational pull against your body. It actually describes the involuntary sound that a minister makes during a 360-degree rollover. I learned, number three, that the call sign of a pilot is stenciled on the back of his helmet. You know, fighter pilots have such great call signs. Buff, Iceman, Hatchet. You want to know what mine was? Max. That's pretty cool, huh? Colonel McLean responds to T-Mac. Tom McLean, T-Mac. It's stenciled on the back of his helmet, just above the collar line. I know this very well, because for 50 out of the 60 minutes, I stared at his name. I read it forward and then backward. I counted the letters plus the hyphen, T-M-A-C. I created an acrostic out of his name. Tell me about Christ. I couldn't stomach looking anywhere else. The horizon kept bouncing. So did the instrument panel. Closing my eyes only increased the nausea. So with T-Mac squarely ahead of me, I decided I'm going to stare at him. After all, he was the man with 6,000 hours of flight time. 6,000 hours of flight time. I decided this fellow spent more time flying planes than I've spent eating pizza. That thought occurred to me as I began regretting what I ate the night before. 6,000 hours. That's the equivalent of 8 months worth of 24-hour days in the cockpit. And I had plenty of time to calculate what that meant. Time enough to circumnavigate the globe 145 times. No wonder he was smiling when we boarded. This sortie was a bike ride on training wheels to him. I actually heard him humming during a bank turn. So it didn't take me long to figure out where to stare. No more looking down or out. I decided I'm staring at T-Mac. And if he's okay, I'm okay. Peter learned a similar lesson the hard way. Exchanged the T6 for a 30-foot fishing boat in the Texas sky for the Galilean Sea. And actually our stories begin to parallel. Here's his story. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now, in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me!" And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Lord, have mercy upon the teaching and the application of your word. Please forgive the sins of the one who speaks, for they are many. And help us to see Jesus in just Jesus. Amen. You know, the Sea of Galilee can be fickle. As famous lakes go, this one is relatively small. It's only 13 miles long and at its widest point, 7.5 miles across. And this diminutive size makes it a sitting duck for the winds that howl down out of the Golan Heights and turn the lake into a blender, shifting suddenly one side and then the other, blowing first one direction and then the other. And the winter storms will bring these winds about once every 2 weeks, lingering sometimes as long as 2 to 3 days. So Galilean fishermen knew storms. They knew that storms would come. They were part of the topography. And forgive me for being the one to remind us, but the first point on your outline is this: life comes with storms. They don't just hover and haunt the Galilean Sea. Life comes in our lives. Storms come in our lives too. The atmospheric conditions of this fallen world in which we live whip up some serious turbulence. Health crises, economic struggles, unwanted invoices and cancer cells. They howl down on our lives and turn our days into a bull ride. Peter and his fellow storm riders knew they were in trouble. Sunlight was a distant memory, and rain fell that night like buckets out of the sky. Lightning sliced the blackness with a silver sword, and the winds began to whip the sails. The boat lurched and lunged like a kite in a March wind. The boat was now in the middle of the sea, Matthew remembers, tossed by the waves. For the wind was what? Isn't that an apt description of the storms of life? There's a sense of contrariness in the circumstances. The gusts and the winds and the gales turn contrarily against you, and they leave you in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, or in the middle of a divorce, tossed by guilt, or in the middle of debt, tossed about by creditors, or in the middle of a corporate takeover, tossed about by Wall Street and profit margins. The disciples fought this storm for 9, mark it down, 9 cold, skin-drenching hours. But about 4 a.m., the unspeakable happened. Jesus comes, commanding the storm. Here's what happened. The disciples spotted someone coming on the water, or something coming on the water. They did not know. They assumed it was a ghost, and they cried from fear. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. They were scared out of their wits. "A ghost!" they said, crying out in terror. You see, they didn't expect Jesus to come to them this way. Neither did we. Neither did we. We expected Jesus would come in the form of peaceful hymns, or Easter Sundays, or quiet retreats. We expected to find Jesus in morning devotionals and church suppers and meditations and happy marriages and bouncing babies. We never expected to see him coming in a storm, talking to us through a birth defect, a death, a lawsuit, or speaking to us in a jail cell. We never expected to see him in a storm, but it is in storms that he does his finest work, for it is in storms that he finally has our attention. And so he comes in storms. He came that night. He replied to their fear with an invitation that's worthy of inscription on every church cornerstone and residential archway. Here's what he said. "Courage! I am. Don't be afraid." I love the way that Frederick Bruner translates this out of the Greek. Courage, I am, don't be afraid. More common readings have, it is I, or I am here, don't be afraid. But I think that loses the full force of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is not merely announcing his presence on the sea. He's declaring his power over the storm. He's not saying, I am here. He is austerely declaring, I am. I am. He is proclaiming to his frightened followers what God said to frightened Moses through the burning bush. Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am, has sent me to you. This is what God said to Abraham in the desert. I am the Lord. And to the Hebrews in the wilderness, I am he, and there is no God besides me. You see, this is no cry of identity. Hey guys, it's me out here. No, it's a claim of divinity. Have courage. I am is here. You see, our pilot has a call name too. Jesus stencils it in bold letters over the billowing clouds. I am. Is anyone in control of these winds? I am. Is anyone aware of what's happening down here? I am. Is anyone coming to help? I am. Courage, I am, he says. Don't be afraid. With these words, Christ laid claim to the title Chief Commander over the storm. And Peter, much to his credit, took Jesus at his word. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Peter didn't know much, but he knew this. He'd rather be out of the boat with Christ than in the boat without him. So he called on the commander to do what commanders do. And what is that? Command. And so Jesus did. And so he said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. And for a few historic steps, In a few heart-stilling moments, Peter did the impossible. He defied every law of gravity and nature, and he walked on the water to go to Jesus. You know, as a writer, I can't help but wonder how Matthew felt when he wrote that sentence. Surely he had to put his pen down, lift up and look out the window and shake his head and say, did that really happen? He walked on the water to Jesus. Now, I got to tell you, my editors wouldn't tolerate such brevity. There would be red ink all over the margin. Explanation, develop, details. How quickly did he exit the boat? How cautious was his first step? Did he step on any fish as he walked? But Matthew doesn't give us any details. Those are forthcoming in our last conversation, our first conversation after this life. I guess Matthew is more concerned that we move quickly to the big point of the story, the major message of the moment, and that is this: where to stare in a storm. And he goes on and writes, but when, speaking of Peter, saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. A wall of water eclipsed his view, or a wind gust snapped the mast with a crack and a slap, or lightning illuminated the lake and the watery mountain range that it had become. Whatever happened, Peter, for just a moment, shifted his glance and his gaze away from Christ, and he focused on the storm. And when he saw the storm more than he saw Jesus, he sunk like a brick in the pond. And the message is unmistakable. If you give your storm waters more attention than you give your storm walker, you're going to sink too. You see, we really have no choice in our lives as to whether or not storms come, do we? But what we do have is a choice as to how much attention those storms will get. I found a direct example of this truth a couple of years ago while I was sitting in the cardiologist's office. The first day I was diagnosed with the problem that I'm so grateful that I don't have any longer. My heart rate had the pace of a NASCAR race. It just wouldn't slow down. And so my family, Doc Jeff Pickens, sent me to a specialist, and he, after giving me some tests and asking me some questions, smiled knowingly and sent me into his office. Now, I didn't like being sent to the principal's office when I was in elementary school. That always meant trouble. And to be quite honest, I didn't like being sent to the doctor's office. I thought, this means trouble. So I went in and I sat down. But my attention turned to a wall full of diplomas. Dr. Garza had diplomas from everywhere. 1 degree from this university, a medical degree from that university, the 3rd degree from his wife. He had diplomas everywhere. And the more I looked at those diplomas, the better I felt. I thought, I'm in good hands. This is a no-brainer for this guy. This is easy. And I was just about to sit back and relax when his nurse entered. And she handed me a sheet of paper and she said, Dr. Garza says this is your condition. He wants you to read over your problems and what might happen. And so I lowered my eyes from the accomplishments of the doctor to the problems of the patient. And I began to read words that I couldn't pronounce. And the ones I could pronounce I didn't like potential stroke and paralysis. And I began to sense that contrary winds were blowing right there in the office. And I began to sink in my own little Sea of Galilee. And then I thought, I don't have to stare at this sheet of paper any longer. I felt a lot better when I was looking at the diplomas. And so I lifted up my eyes and I looked at the diplomas. And then I read a little more on the paper. And then I read some diplomas. Then I looked a little more in the paper. I found it a lot easier to weather the storm the more I looked at the physician. That's what God calls us to do. Friends, He's not calling you to naivete or to turn a blind eye to the struggles and challenges you have. You have challenges and struggles. Storms come. But He's just calling on you not to let the focus of your eyes be simply on the storm and solely on the waves, but to look at Him as much as you look at them. The Scriptures say we must pay closer attention to what we have heard. We must pay closer attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift away from it. The big point of the story is simply this: feed your faith and your fears will starve. Feed your faith and your fears will starve. But feed your fears and your faith will. Do whatever it takes to keep your gaze on Jesus. That is priority number one. Memorize Scripture, sing hymns, read biographies of great lives, ponder the testimonies of faithful Christians, walk to the sound of His voice, make the deliberate decision to set your hope on Him, and when your attention turns away, bring it back like Jeremiah did. Slide down the timeline for just a moment to the left, about 600 years, and learn a lesson from this Old Testament prophet. You talk about a person who's caught in a storm. Look what he wrote. He said, I am the man who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. He has driven and brought me into darkness without any light. Surely against me he turns his hand again and again the whole day long. Jeremiah is utterly depressed. He is in the depths of despair. His world has collapsed around him, and he's blaming God. He's blaming God for this horrible emotional distress. And he's not through complaining. He goes on and blames God for his physical ailment. He, speaking of God, has made my flesh and my skin waste away and broken my bones. His attitude stinks. His body hurts. His heart is sick. His faith is puny. He goes on and says, God has besieged and enveloped me with bitterness and tribulation. Jeremiah felt like a trapped man at the end of a dead-end street. He says, He, speaking of God, has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me. Though I call and cry for help, He shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stones. He has made my paths crooked. All Jeremiah can see is the storm around him. But then, for whatever reason, Jeremiah realizes that if he keeps up this thought pattern, he's going to sink. And so he makes a decision. He's going to stare at the diplomas. He lifts up his eyes, and look what he says. You'll love this first sentence. But to this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in Him. Do you see what Jeremiah just did? But to this I will call to mind. He changed his mind. He lifted his eyes. He shifted his gaze. Depressed Jeremiah was going down. And so Jeremiah says, you know, I'm not making any progress staring at this storm. I'm going to lift up my eyes. Peter eventually did too, even as he was sinking. After a few moments of flailing, he turned back to Christ and he cried out, "Lord, save me!" And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed in the boat, the wind died down. Now, Jesus could have stilled the storm about 9 hours earlier, don't you think? But he didn't. I wonder why. You think he was wanting to teach his followers a lesson? Jesus could have stilled your storm a long time ago. But he hasn't. You think he's trying to teach you a lesson? You think he's just going to let the winds blow and the waves bounce a little longer until finally we do what he wants us to do? And we lift up our eyes from the waves and turn our ears from the wind. And we begin to look at the diplomas that our Father has hung in the heavens. Star-studded sky. We begin to look at the accomplishments that our Father has in history. Not just 6,000 hours of flight time, but century after century of faithful provision and protection of his children. Could it be that he just wants to get our attention? Are you scared in your storm? Then don't stare at the storm. Stare at the commander. And be assured, this may be your flight and your first flight, but it's not his. He's been through this before.